March 15, 1974. Producer Richard Byrne had just finished destroying a young actor's dreams in front of 40 crew members. "My little daughter could do it better," he laughed, pointing at Stallone Slyvester's trembling hands. What happened in the next 2 minutes changed everything. Sylvester didn't break. He didn't walk away. Instead, he stepped forward, grabbed the script, and delivered the most haunting performance anyone on that set had ever witnessed. The cameras weren't rolling, but 3 people were recording. Within hours, bootleg copies spread through underground Hollywood networks. Studio executives called emergency meetings. Agents started bidding wars over a kid they'd never heard of. That performance launched a legend. It also signed Slyvester's death warrant, because Richard Byrne never forgave anyone who made him look like a fool. And some humiliations, he believed, could only be answered with blood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. The silence stretched like a taut wire across Stage 7. 200 of Hollywood's most powerful players sat frozen in their seats. Executive assistants clutching their phones, agents calculating damage control strategies in real time. Richard Byrne's laughter had cut through the air like a blade, and now everyone waited to see how deep the wound would go. Sylvester Stallone stood under the harsh studio lights, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning that kept the soundstage at a crisp 68 degrees. His hands, those legendary hands that had pummeled Apollo Creed and gripped machine guns in a dozen action franchises, trembled at his sides. The script pages fluttered slightly in his grip. "Did you hear me, Sly?" Byrne's voice carried across the stage with theatrical precision. The producer adjusted his Italian silk tie, a predator sensing vulnerability. "I said my little girl Emma, she's 8, by the way, could deliver that monologue with more conviction than what I just witnessed." A nervous chuckle rippled through the crowd. Studio heads exchanged glances. 3 entertainment reporters in the back row leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. Stallone's jaw worked silently. The muscle in his cheek twitched, a tell that had cost him poker games but never a performance. Until today. His voice, when it finally came, carried a rasp that had nothing to do with his iconic Rocky Balboa speech patterns. "You want to run that by me again, Richard?" The formality stung. Everyone on set called Byrne Dick, a nickname he'd earned through 2 decades of theatrical cruelty disguised as artistic vision. But this wasn't the friendly ribbing of longtime collaborators. This was a line drawn in the sand. Byrne stepped closer, his handmade Italian loafers clicking against the polished concrete floor. At 55, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd greenlit billion-dollar franchises and buried careers with equal enthusiasm. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his tan meticulously maintained. Everything about him screamed success, the kind that survives by feeding on failure. "I'm saying," Byrne continued, his voice rising so the cheap seats could hear, "that whatever's happening with you, the shaking, the mumbling, this shadow of what you used to be, it's not working. It's painful to watch." The crowd stirred. Someone's phone buzzed. A camera assistant cleared his throat and looked away. Stallone's breathing changed. The tremor in his hands intensified for a moment, then stopped completely. His shoulders squared. Something shifted behind his eyes, a darkness that belonged less to Rocky Balboa and more to Judge Dredd. "Painful to watch," he repeated, tasting the words. "You know what's painful, Dick? Sitting through 3 hours of your last picture." But I didn't laugh. You know why? The stage fell silent, except for the hum of electrical equipment. Because I'm a professional. Byrne's smile faltered for the first time. This wasn't going according to script. The humiliation was supposed to break Stallone down, not build him up. The producer glanced toward the executives in the front row, studio heads who'd flown in specifically to witness this moment. "Sly, maybe we should what?" Stallone took a step forward. The movement was predatory, controlled. "Maybe we should pretend you didn't just disrespect me in front of 200 people? Maybe we should act like you haven't been planning this little performance for weeks?" A collective intake of breath swept through the audience. This was veering off script from the typical Hollywood power play. Usually, the star took the hit, made excuses, slunk away to let their agents spin the damage. But Stallone wasn't playing by the usual rules. He moved to center stage, directly under the key light that had exposed every flaw in his previous attempt. But something had changed. The tremor was gone. His voice carried clear and strong to every corner of the soundstage. "You want to see acting, Dick? You want to see what 25 years in this business teaches a man?" Byrne opened his mouth to respond, but Stallone had already begun. Not the scripted monologue from the failed scene, but something else entirely. Something raw and dangerous that pulled every eye in the room to his face and held them there like a magnetic force. The performance that followed would be dissected in film schools for decades. Entertainment Weekly would call it career resurrection in real time. Variety would run a cover story titled "The Phoenix Rises." But in that moment, as Stallone's voice filled every corner of Stage 7 with a power that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than technique, only one thing mattered. Richard Byrne had just learned the difference between breaking a man and unleashing one. #Chapter 2. Introduction. The performance lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Stallone would know the exact duration later, when the bootleg footage surfaced on industry message boards and trade publication websites. But in those moments under the unforgiving stage lights, time moved like honey through a sieve, thick, deliberate, and impossibly sweet. When he finished, the silence that followed had weight. It pressed against eardrums and settled in chests like a held breath. 200 industry professionals sat motionless, caught between disbelief and recognition that they'd witnessed something extraordinary. Even the camera operators had forgotten to look away from their viewfinders. Stallone's chest rose and fell with measured breaths. The tremor crept back into his left hand, subtle, but there. He closed his fist slowly, feeling the familiar flutter of muscles that no longer obeyed with military precision. Richard Byrne stood frozen at stage left, his expression unreadable. For a man who'd built an empire on reaction shots and perfectly timed reveals, he seemed unusually caught off guard. His mouth opened, closed, then settled into what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Well," Byrne said finally, his voice carrying none of its earlier venom, "that's more like it." The spell broke. Conversation erupted across the soundstage, hushed, urgent exchanges between executives and their assistants. Phones appeared like magic tricks, fingers flying across screens. The machinery of Hollywood publicity was already grinding to life, spinning the narrative before it could spin itself. Stallone barely heard it. His focus had narrowed to a pinpoint, the way it always did after intense scenes. The adrenaline that had carried him through the impromptu monologue was ebbing now, leaving behind the familiar ache in his joints and the slight slur that crept into his consonants when exhaustion set in. "Sly." Byrne approached with measured steps, his earlier hostility replaced by something harder to define. "We need to talk. Later, Dick." Stallone's voice was hoarse now, spent. "I need some air." He walked toward the stage exit, past the clusters of industry players who parted like water before him. Some nodded, respectful acknowledgments of what they'd just witnessed. Others simply stared, as if seeing him for the first time, or perhaps seeing him clearly for the first time in years. The late afternoon Los Angeles sun hit him like a physical thing as he stepped outside Stage 7. The studio lot stretched before him in all its artificial glory, false fronts and perfect facades that had convinced the world that dreams came true here. At 52, Stallone knew better. Dreams didn't come true in Hollywood. They were manufactured, focus-grouped, and test-marketed until they bore only passing resemblance to their original form. His cell phone buzzed against his chest. He ignored it, just as he'd ignored the previous dozen calls. His agent, his manager, his publicist, they'd all want to discuss what had just happened, to analyze and strategize and position. But right now, he needed quiet. The parking garage smelled of concrete and exhaust fumes. His black Mercedes waited in its designated spot, license plate reading Rocky 7, a reminder of better days when sequels were celebrations rather than desperate attempts at relevance. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, not starting the engine, just breathing. The tremor in his left hand was more pronounced now. He held it up to the light filtering through the garage's fluorescent fixtures. watching the almost imperceptible shake that had become his secret companion over the past 8 months. His doctor had been cautiously optimistic: early detection, manageable symptoms, decades of productive life ahead. But Hollywood wasn't known for its patience with aging action heroes, and age was the least of his problems now. His phone buzzed again. This time he looked. Jennifer. His wife's name on the screen brought the first genuine smile to his face since he'd stepped onto stage 7 that morning. He answered on the third ring. "How'd it go?" Her voice carried that particular blend of concern and forced optimism that he'd been hearing more often lately. "Better than expected," he said, which wasn't quite a lie. "I saw some posts already. Twitter's going crazy. Good crazy, I think." Of course the footage was already circulating. Nothing stayed private in this town for more than 30 seconds. He wondered how long it would take for the inevitable think pieces to appear. Stallone's comeback, desperation, or genius? Or has-been hero finds his voice again. "I'm heading home," he said. "Good. Sophia made your favorite pasta. And before you ask, yes, the low-sodium version." The mundane domesticity of it grounded him. Dinner with his family. Conversation that didn't revolve around box office numbers or test screenings. Normal life, the kind that existed beyond studio gates and industry politics. As he drove through the winding roads of Beverly Hills, Stallone caught glimpses of his reflection in the rearview mirror. The face looking back was older than he remembered, marked by years of physical roles and late nights and the particular kind of exhaustion that came from fighting to stay relevant in a young person's industry. But there was something else there, too. Something that hadn't been present when he'd arrived at the studio that morning. A glimmer of the man who'd written Rocky in 3.5 days, who'd refused to sell the script unless he could star in it, who'd built an empire on the simple belief that underdogs could win if they fought hard enough. The tremor in his hand had stopped completely. Chapter 3, Inciting Incident. The Beverly Hills mansion felt different when he pulled into the circular driveway. Not physically. The Mediterranean architecture still projected the same old-money elegance. The fountain still bubbled with clockwork precision. The security gates still gleamed with fresh polish. But something had shifted in the hours since he'd left that morning, as if the house itself sensed the change in him. Stallone sat in the Mercedes for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. Through the tall windows he could see warm light spilling from the kitchen, where Sophia would be putting finishing touches on dinner. Jennifer would be setting the table with their good china, the spode they'd received as a wedding gift and only used when something felt significant. His phone had been mercifully quiet during the drive home, but as he reached for the door handle, it erupted in a cacophony of buzzes and chimes. Text messages cascaded across the screen faster than he could read them. His agent, his manager, 3 different entertainment reporters, someone from Variety wanting a quote, and then, buried among the industry noise, a number that made his blood freeze. The 412 area code hit him like a physical blow. Pittsburgh, home. But not just any Pittsburgh number. This one was seared into his memory from 1,000 sleepless nights. 1,000 moments of guilt that had shaped every decision he'd made for the past 15 years. He stared at the screen until it went dark, his reflection ghosting over the black glass. The tremor in his hand returned with interest, spreading up his arm like wildfire. When the phone buzzed again with a voicemail notification, he nearly dropped it. The message was brief. 7 words that turned his stomach to ice water. "I saw the news. We need to talk." The voice was older now, weathered by years and cigarettes and disappointment, but unmistakably her. Maria Santos, the woman whose story he'd stolen, whose life he'd cannibalized to feed his own legend. The real boxer from South Philadelphia whose rise from nothing had inspired Rocky, and whose silence he'd bought with guilt money and legal threats when she'd tried to claim credit. Stallone's breath came in short, sharp bursts. The success of the afternoon, the triumph over Burns' humiliation, the fragile hope he'd felt building in his chest, all of it crumbled like tissue paper in the rain. Maria had been quiet for 5 years, not since the 20th anniversary of Rocky's release, when she'd tried to publish her memoir and his lawyers had buried it in cease and desist orders. He'd convinced himself she was done, that the monthly checks his accountant sent to her small apartment in Fishtown would keep her satisfied forever. But she'd seen the footage. Everyone had seen the footage. And something about his performance that afternoon had awakened whatever sleeping demon had kept her silent all these years. The front door opened, and Jennifer appeared, framed in golden light, like something from a Norman Rockwell painting. She waved, her smile bright and uncomplicated, still believing in the fairy tale of his comeback. Behind her, he could see Sophia arranging bread in a basket, domestic life continuing its gentle rhythm. His phone buzzed again, another 412 number, different from Maria's. This time the message was a photo, grainy but unmistakable. A young woman in boxing gloves, sweat slicked and fierce, standing over a fallen opponent in some forgotten gymnasium. The timestamp read 1974, 2 years before he'd written Rocky. The accompanying text was from someone named David Santos. "My mother isn't looking for money anymore. She's looking for justice. Thought you should know the documentary comes out next month." The phone slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering against the leather seat. Documentary. The word echoed in his skull like a death sentence. In this age of social media and viral exposés, a well-crafted documentary could destroy a career faster than any box office bomb. And if Maria had evidence, photos, witness testimonies, proof that Rocky's story wasn't his to tell, it wouldn't matter how brilliant his performance had been that afternoon. Through the windshield, he watched Jennifer approach the car, her expression shifting from joy to concern as she registered his stricken face. In 30 seconds, she would reach the driver's side door. She would ask what was wrong, and he would have to decide how much truth their marriage could bear. The tremor in his hand had become a full shake now, but this time it wasn't his body betraying him. It was fear, pure and simple. The fear of a man who'd built everything on borrowed ground and was about to watch it all sink into the earth. Maria Santos was coming for him. After 15 years of silence, after decades of letting him live with the lie that had made him a legend, she was ready to tell the world the truth about Rocky, and there was nowhere left to run. Chapter 4, Early Development. Sly? Jennifer's voice carried through the driver's side window like an echo from another lifetime. What's wrong? He forced his fingers to work, to close around the phone and slip it into his jacket pocket. The practiced smile came easier than breathing. 30 years of press conferences and premieres had taught him to manufacture normalcy even when the world was ending. Just processing the day, he said, stepping out of the Mercedes. The lie tasted familiar on his tongue, another small betrayal in a life built on them. Jennifer's arms wrapped around him, and for a moment he let himself sink into her warmth. She smelled like vanilla and the expensive perfume he'd bought her for their anniversary, scents that belonged to the life he'd built on borrowed time. "You're shaking," she whispered against his chest. "Adrenaline," he said quickly. "It was intense today." She pulled back to study his face, and he saw the exact moment when she decided not to push. It was a look he'd been seeing more often lately. Loving concern wrapped around growing suspicion, like a bandage over an infected wound. Dinner passed in a haze of forced conversation. Sophia chattered about her college applications, her voice bright with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted that her father was a hero. Jennifer talked about her charity work, something involving inner-city kids in boxing programs. The irony nearly choked him. "The pasta's perfect," he managed, though each bite felt like swallowing sand. "You're not eating," Jennifer observed. "Still wound up from today." The half-truth burned worse than silence. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with incoming messages. His publicist, his agent, industry vultures circling the fresh blood of his afternoon performance. But underneath the congratulatory noise, he could feel Maria Santos waiting like a cancer in his chest. After dinner, he retreated to his study, claiming script revisions that didn't exist. The room felt smaller than usual, its walls lined with awards and photographs that now seemed like evidence in a coming trial. The Oscar for Rocky glinted from its place of honor, a golden reminder of everything he stood to lose. His laptop screen glowed to life, and against every instinct, he found himself typing her name into Google. Maria Santos documentary. The search results hit him like a freight train. Entertainment Weekly had already picked up the story. Variety was calling it explosive. Someone had leaked a teaser trailer, 30 seconds of Maria's weathered face staring directly into the camera, her voice steady as granite. "The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how much money you throw at it." His hands found the bottle of scotch in his desk drawer. 18-year-old Macallan that he'd been saving for a special occasion. The irony wasn't lost on him as he poured 3 fingers into a crystal tumbler. The alcohol burned, but not enough to wash away the taste of fear. He'd survived box office bombs, critical savagery, the slow torture of becoming a punchline. But this was different. This would destroy not just his career, but the mythology that had sustained 3 generations of moviegoers. The underdog story that had inspired millions would be revealed as theft, and there would be no redemption arc for Sylvester Stallone. His phone rang. Not Maria this time, but his agent, Barry Weinstock, a 60-year-old shark who'd guided his career through its highest peaks and lowest valleys. "You see it?" Barry's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Yeah. My sources say she's got photos, newspaper clippings from the 70s, before Rocky was even a script." "Jesus, Sly, why didn't you tell me about this woman?" "Because I thought she'd stay buried," he thought. "Because I convinced myself the lie had become the truth through sheer repetition." "What do we do?" he asked instead. The silence on the other end stretched too long. Barry Weinstock, the man who'd once convinced a studio to let an unknown actor star in his own script, had no answers. "I'll make some calls," Barry said finally. "See if we can contain this before it goes wide." But they both knew it was too late for containment. In the age of social media, scandals moved at light speed. By morning, Rocky Truth would be trending worldwide. After hanging up, Stallone sat in the gathering darkness, watching Los Angeles spread out below his window like a circuit board. Somewhere out there, Maria Santos was preparing to detonate a bomb that would crater his entire existence. And somewhere else, Richard Byrne was probably laughing at the cosmic joke of it all. The great comeback performance happening just as the foundation cracked beneath his feet. His reflection stared back at him from the window, ghost-like and hollow. The tremor in his hands had evolved into something deeper, a shaking that seemed to emanate from his very core. For the first time in decades, Sylvester Stallone didn't know how the story would end. Chapter 5, Middle Development. The scotch had stopped working hours ago, but Stallone kept pouring anyway. Each amber measure in the crystal tumbler represented another year of living the lie, another birthday cake blown out, while Maria Santos collected grocery store paychecks in Philadelphia. The Macallan tasted like ash now, but the ritual of lifting glass to lips gave his trembling hands something to do. 3 a.m. in Beverly Hills meant 6 a.m. in Pittsburgh. Maria would be awake by now, probably sitting at the same Formica kitchen table where she'd once shown him the newspaper clippings, a 22-year-old woman boxer making headlines in a world that barely acknowledged female athletes existed. He'd been nobody then, just another struggling actor waiting tables and dreaming of his big break. She'd been kind to him during those 2 weeks when he'd crashed at her cousin's place, kind enough to share her story of fighting her way out of poverty, one knockout at a time. He'd never meant to steal it. That was the hell of it. The theft had been gradual, unconscious, like carbon monoxide poisoning. A detail here, a character trait there, until Maria's entire life had been reconstructed in his imagination as Rocky Balboa's journey. By the time he'd finished writing the script in that marathon 72-hour session, he'd convinced himself the story was his own, born from his own struggles and dreams. The study door creaked open behind him. Jennifer stood in the doorway, silk robe wrapped tight against the California chill, her hair tousled from sleep she clearly hadn't been getting. "It's 3:30, she said softly. Couldn't sleep. She padded across the Persian rug in bare feet, and he caught her reflection in the window, a ghost walking through his haunted house. When she reached his chair, her hands found his shoulders, beginning the gentle massage that had become routine during his most troubled nights. "The tremor's worse," she said. It wasn't a question. He wanted to tell her everything then, about Maria, about the documentary that would air in 4 weeks, about the empire of lies that was about to come crashing down around their perfectly appointed life. Instead, he reached up to cover her hand with his own. "Just stress," he said. "From what? Today was good, wasn't it? Everyone's saying the performance was incredible. Incredible." The word twisted in his gut like a blade. Every performance was incredible when you'd been method acting someone else's life for 22 years. "Jen," he began, then stopped. What could he possibly say? That their Beverly Hills mansion was built on stolen ground? That Sophia's college fund was Maria Santos's money, laundered through decades of sequels and merchandising deals? That the man she'd married was a fiction as elaborate as any character he'd played on screen? What is it? Her hands stilled on his shoulders. Nothing, just tired. But Jennifer had been married to an actor long enough to recognize a performance. She moved around the chair to face him, her eyes searching his face in the amber glow of the desk lamp. This isn't about today, is it? This is about whatever you've been hiding for the past 6 months. The phone on his desk chose that moment to ring. At 3:30 in the morning, it could only be one person. He stared at the display, 412 area code, and felt something die inside his chest. Jennifer followed his gaze. Who calls at this hour? Nobody important. But his hand was shaking so violently now that he couldn't have answered, even if he'd wanted to. The phone rang 8 times before falling silent, and in that silence, he heard the sound of his marriage cracking along fault lines he'd spent years pretending didn't exist. Sly. Jennifer's voice had gone cold, the tone she used when Sophia lied about homework or curfew. Who was that? The voicemail notification chimed. Then another. Then a text message that lit up the screen for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for both of them to read the preview. Stop ignoring me. The premiere is in 4 weeks. After that, the whole world will know what you did to. The message cut off, but the damage was complete. Jennifer stepped back from the chair as if she'd been struck, her silk robe suddenly seeming inadequate protection against the chill that had invaded the room. What did you do? She whispered. Stallone closed his eyes and felt the weight of 22 years pressing down on his chest. Outside, Los Angeles was beginning to stir, early commuters and late-night revelers creating the ambient hum of a city that never quite slept. Soon the sun would rise on what might be his last day as the man his family believed him to be. When he opened his eyes, Jennifer was still waiting for an answer that would explain away the inexplicable, justify the unjustifiable. But some stories don't have happy endings, and some lies are too big for forgiveness. Everything, he said finally. I did everything. Chapter 6. Plot twist. The words hung between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Jennifer's face went through a sequence of emotions, confusion, disbelief, then a dawning horror that made Stallone's chest tighten with something beyond guilt. What do you mean, everything? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Before he could answer, his phone erupted again. This time he grabbed it, desperate to silence the mechanical intrusion into his crumbling marriage. But the caller ID made his blood freeze in his veins. Richard Byrne. At 3:45 in the morning, the man who had humiliated him 12 hours earlier was calling. Stallone stared at the screen, his mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. Then, with Jennifer watching, he answered, Richard. Brilliant work today, Sly. Byrne's voice carried none of yesterday's contempt. Instead, there was something else, satisfaction, almost pride, though I think we pushed it a bit far with the Parkinson's angle. Jennifer's buying it? The study tilted on its axis. Stallone looked at his wife, whose face had gone white as parchment, then back at the phone that had become a live grenade in his hand. Richard, I can't. Relax. We're past the point of pretense now. Maria played her part perfectly tonight, didn't she? That documentary trailer should start trending within the hour. The timing couldn't be better. The world inverted. Maria, the documentary, the threatening calls from Pittsburgh. You're telling me. Stallone's voice cracked like thin ice. Christ, you really committed to the role, didn't you? Byrne's laughter was warm, almost paternal. I told you method acting would be the key. 3 months of living as a broken man, letting the industry write you off, even fooling your own family. That performance this afternoon, pure gold. Authentic desperation. Jennifer sank into the leather chair across from his desk, her hand pressed to her mouth. The tremors, Stallone said slowly. The forgetfulness. The beta blockers and mild sedatives. Dr. Hoffman said you'd experience some side effects, but nothing permanent. Though I have to admit, when you started believing your own performance, I worried we'd gone too deep. The phone felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Maria Santos. The documentary about Rocky being stolen. Our masterpiece. Byrne's voice was rich with satisfaction. Maria's been our consultant for 6 months. Amazing woman, by the way. She never wanted credit for inspiring Rocky. She just wanted to help create the most authentic comeback story Hollywood's ever seen. The leaked documentary footage? We shot it in my editing room last week. Stallone's vision tunneled. Every sleepless night, every moment of gut-wrenching terror, every second of believing his life was about to implode, all of it orchestrated. The pills Dr. Hoffman had prescribed for stress that had made his hands shake and his mind fog. The mysterious phone calls that had driven him to the edge of breakdown. Even Jennifer's growing concern had been part of the web. "You drugged me," he whispered. "We prepared you. There's a difference. An actor can simulate desperation, but to truly capture it, to make an audience believe they're watching a man's soul break in real time, you have to live it." Method acting taken to its logical conclusion. Jennifer was on her feet now, pacing behind her chair like a caged animal. "You son of a bitch," she said, loud enough for Byrne to hear through the phone. "You made him think he was sick. You made us all think—" "Jennifer." Byrne's tone shifted, becoming almost gentle. "You were magnificent, too. Your growing concern, the way you watched him deteriorate, it informed his performance in ways even he didn't realize. The broken man you saw these past 3 months, that desperation translated into the most honest acting of his career." Stallone set the phone on speaker and leaned back in his chair, feeling like he was floating outside his own body. The producer's daughter comment. "You calling my acting pathetic? Theater, Sly. All theater. I needed you to hit rock bottom in front of those cameras. Needed you to forget you were performing and just exist in that moment of complete professional annihilation." The cruelest irony crashed over him in waves. He'd been method acting his own destruction so thoroughly that he'd lost track of where performance ended and reality began. The man who had revolutionized underdog stories had become one, not through circumstance, but through elaborate deception. "How long?" Jennifer's voice was sharp as broken glass. "From the beginning," Byrne said. "Every flop, every bad review, every humiliation over the past year, we orchestrated all of it. Created the conditions for the most authentic comeback performance in cinema history." Stallone looked at his wife, seeing his own sense of violated reality reflected in her eyes. They had been actors in someone else's story without even knowing it, puppets dancing to invisible strings. "The whole world will see that footage," Byrne continued. "And they'll witness something unprecedented. A man genuinely fighting for his artistic life, unaware that his salvation was always assured." In that moment, Stallone understood that Richard Byrne's greatest arrogance wasn't his cruelty, it was his absolute certainty that the ends justified the means, that human suffering was acceptable as long as it served great art. But some performances extract a price that no audience should ever demand. #Chapter 7. Climax build-up. The silence that followed Byrne's revelation stretched like a wire about to snap. Stallone stared at the phone, watching his producer's name glow on the speaker display, while Jennifer stood frozen behind her chair, her knuckles white against the leather. "You're insane," she said finally, her voice barely controlled. "You manipulated us for months, made us believe—" "That he was dying?" Byrne's voice carried no remorse. "That his career was over? Jennifer, those fears were already there. I simply amplified them, gave them focus. The performance required absolute authenticity." Stallone found his voice, though it felt like speaking through broken glass. "The pills. How long have I been taking them?" 3 months. Just enough to create the physical symptoms without permanent damage. Dr. Hoffman monitored everything. We couldn't risk actual harm. "Couldn't risk harm?" Jennifer's composure finally shattered. "Do you know what the past 3 months have been like? Watching him shake at dinner, seeing him forget conversations, lying awake wondering if I was going to lose my husband?" "Your suffering informed his performance," Byrne said simply. "Made it real. The cameras picked up every micro-expression, every moment of genuine fear. That's what makes it art." Stallone stood slowly, his legs unsteady, whether from the residual effects of whatever Byrne had been feeding him or from pure rage, he couldn't tell. "Art? You call destroying someone's peace of mind art? I call creating the performance of your lifetime art. Tomorrow's dailies will prove it. The footage we capture today, it's transcendent, Sly. Raw human emotion filtered through decades of craft. It's what every actor dreams of achieving. The study felt smaller with each passing second, the walls closing in like a trap. Stallone walked to the window, staring out at the pre-dawn darkness that still cloaked Los Angeles. Somewhere in that sprawling city, other people were living their lives, honest lives, unmarked by elaborate deceptions and chemical manipulations. Maria Santos, he said. Is she even real? Very real. And she genuinely inspired Rocky, that part was true. But she never wanted money or credit. When we approached her about the project, she was intrigued by the artistic possibilities, the chance to help create something unprecedented. Jennifer moved around the chair, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug. So everything was a lie. The documentary, the threats, even his symptoms. Not lies. Performance preparation. The greatest method acting experiment ever attempted. At our expense. Byrne's pause was telling. At the expense of comfort, yes. But consider what we've achieved. Stallone's career resurrection will be complete by morning. The industry that wrote him off will be forced to confront a performance that redefines what's possible. Stallone turned from the window, studying his wife's face in the amber lamplight. She looked older somehow, as if the revelation had aged her in real time. The trust he saw cracking behind her eyes represented 20 years of marriage built on assumptions about the man she'd chosen to love. You violated us, he said to the phone. Not just me, my family, my daughter. Sophia was never involved. We kept her completely separate. She watched me shake at dinner. Saw me struggling to remember things. You think that didn't affect her? For the first time, Byrne's confidence seemed to waver. Collateral impact was regrettable, but necessary for the authenticity of... Stop. Stallone's voice cut through the speaker like a blade. Stop talking about authenticity. There's nothing authentic about poisoning someone and calling it art. Jennifer had moved to stand beside him at the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. When she spoke, her voice carried a chill that made the pre-dawn air seem warm. How many people were involved? How many people knew what you were doing to us while we thought our world was falling apart? A small team. Dr. Hoffman, Maria, myself, and a few key technical personnel. Everyone signed comprehensive NDAs. NDAs. Jennifer laughed, but there was no humor in it. Legal protection for an elaborate psychological assault. Stallone felt something crystallizing in his chest. Not the manufactured desperation Byrne had chemically induced, but genuine anger. Clean, pure, and entirely his own. The performance today, you said the cameras captured everything. Every second. From the moment I called you pathetic until you delivered that final monologue. It's unprecedented footage, Sly. The industry will what? Applaud you for proving that great art justifies any means? That human dignity is acceptable collateral damage? The silence from the phone stretched longer this time. When Byrne finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its certainty. You're experiencing shock. It's natural. In a few days, when you see the footage, when you understand what we've created together. We didn't create anything together, Stallone said. You created a lie. I was just the victim you used to sell it. He reached for the phone, his finger hovering over the disconnect button. One touch would end this conversation, but it wouldn't end what Byrne had done to them. The violation would remain, carved into their marriage like scar tissue. But as he stared at the glowing screen, Stallone realized something that made his blood run cold. Byrne was wrong about one thing. The performance wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time, Sylvester Stallone would be the one writing the script. Chapter 8, Climax. Stallone's finger pressed the disconnect button with surgical precision. The silence that followed felt like the moment after a gunshot. Profound, ringing, irreversible. Jennifer stood beside him at the window, her reflection wavering in the glass like a question mark punctuating the end of everything they'd believed about their lives. What are you going to do? She asked. He turned to face her fully, seeing for the first time in months without the chemical fog that had clouded his vision. The woman before him had endured 3 months of watching her husband disintegrate, had carried the weight of believing she might lose him to disease or career destruction, all while Richard Byrne collected footage like a vampire feeding on authentic suffering. I'm going to destroy him, Stallone said simply. The phone buzzed with an incoming call. Byrne again. This time, Stallone answered immediately, putting it on speaker before the second ring. Hanging up was childish, Sly. We need to discuss the release strategy. Richard Stallone's voice carried a calm that seemed to reach through the speaker and grab his producer by the throat. I want you to listen very carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. Sly, you're still processing. You made one critical error in your little experiment. You assumed that because you controlled the performance, you controlled the performer. But here's what you failed to understand about method acting. Sometimes the role changes the actor permanently. Burns' pause was telling. What are you saying? I'm saying that the broken man you created, he's gone. And the man who's taken his place isn't interested in your artistic vision. He's interested in justice. Jennifer moved closer, her hand finding his arm. The gesture was tentative, testing whether the foundation of their marriage could support the weight of what had been revealed. The footage belongs to Meridian Pictures, Burns said, his voice regaining some authority. Contractually, you have no control over... The footage was obtained through fraud, criminal fraud. You administered drugs without informed consent, conducted psychological manipulation that borders on torture, and documented it all for profit. Stallone walked to his desk, pulling open the top drawer where he kept his personal attorney's card. I'm calling David Brenner. By morning, every frame of your masterpiece will be sealed as evidence. You're being dramatic. No jury would what? Convict a man who drugged a 52-year-old actor with beta blockers and sedatives without his knowledge? Who used his wife's genuine fear as a performance prop? Richard, you didn't just cross ethical lines, you obliterated them. The silence from the phone stretched until Stallone wondered if the call had dropped. When Byrne finally spoke, his voice had shed its earlier confidence like a snake molting skin. The performance is already edited. The industry will see it with or without your cooperation. Then you'll see it from a federal prison cell. Stallone picked up his attorney's card, reading the emergency number printed in small type at the bottom. Because here's what's going to happen. I'm filing criminal charges. Dr. Hoffman's medical license will be reviewed for prescribing unnecessary medications under false pretenses. Maria Santos, assuming she exists and wasn't another one of your fabrications, will be questioned about her involvement in fraud. And every person who signed your precious NDAs will be subpoenaed to testify. Jennifer squeezed his arm, and he realized she was trembling. Not from cold, but from something approaching awe. The man she was watching dismantle Richard Burns' empire wasn't the chemically compromised victim who had stumbled through the past 3 months. This was someone new, forged in the fire of Burns' manipulation but no longer controlled by it. You're destroying your own comeback, Burns said desperately. The performance was built on a foundation of lies. What part of that do you think the industry will celebrate once the truth comes out? Your unprecedented footage becomes evidence of criminal conspiracy the moment I file charges. Stallone could hear Burns breathing through the speaker, rapid and shallow. The predator was becoming prey, and they all knew it. There's another problem with your experiment, Richard, Stallone continued, his voice growing quieter and somehow more dangerous. You created a performance of a man with nothing left to lose. Well, congratulations, you succeeded. The man talking to you now really has nothing left to lose. My career was already destroyed in your little theater production. My marriage may not survive what you've done to it, but I'll be damned if I let you profit from it. The phone went silent. Then, a dial tone. Stallone looked at Jennifer, seeing his own transformation reflected in her eyes. He wasn't the same man who had answered Burns' call 30 minutes ago. That man was gone, dissolved in the acid of truth. Call David, Jennifer said quietly. Make them pay for what they did to us. As dawn broke over Los Angeles, Sylvester Stallone reached for his phone to begin writing the final scene of Richard Burns' career. Chapter 9. Resolution. The first rays of morning sun filtered through the study windows as Stallone dialed David Brenner's emergency line. Jennifer had moved to the couch, curled into herself like someone seeking warmth after a long fever had finally broken. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of everything that needed to be rebuilt. Sly? David's voice was thick with sleep and concern. Christ, it's 6 in the morning. I need you to file criminal charges against Richard Byrne and Meridian Pictures. Fraud, assault with a controlled substance, conspiracy. Stallone's voice was steady now, purged of the artificial tremor that had plagued him for months. "I'll explain everything, but I need you to move fast. They have footage they obtained illegally, and they're planning to release it." 3 weeks later, Stallone stood on the courthouse steps as reporters shouted questions about the Hollywood method acting scandal that had consumed the industry. David emerged from the building behind him, carrying a briefcase full of sealed indictments and a restraining order that had frozen all of Byrne's assets. "Mr. Stallone, how does it feel to know that Richard Byrne has been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison?" a reporter called out. He paused, considering the question. How did it feel? Not triumphant, exactly. Justice didn't erase the violation. It didn't give him back the 3 months of believing his body was betraying him, or restore the nights Jennifer had lain awake wondering if she was watching her husband die by degrees. "It feels like accountability," he said finally. "Nothing more, nothing less." The crowd of reporters parted as he walked toward the waiting car where Jennifer sat in the passenger seat. She'd attended every hearing, watched every piece of evidence presented to the court. Together, they'd seen the full scope of Byrne's manipulation laid bare, the medical consultations where Dr. Hoffman had prescribed unnecessary medications, the staged phone calls designed to increase Stallone's paranoia, even the calculated timing of each humiliation to maximize psychological impact. Dr. Hoffman had lost his license. Maria Santos, it turned out, was real but had been deceived about the true nature of Byrne's project. She'd believed she was participating in an authorized documentary about method acting, not an elaborate psychological assault. Her testimony had been particularly damning. As they drove through Los Angeles traffic, Stallone found himself studying the city with new eyes. The billboards advertising summer blockbusters, the studios where dreams were manufactured and destroyed, the endless sprawl of ambition and artifice. It all looked different now. He'd seen behind the curtain and discovered that some magic came at too high a price. "Sophia called while you were in court," Jennifer said. "She wants to have dinner this weekend." Their daughter had taken the revelation harder than either of them expected. Learning that her father's months of visible suffering had been artificially induced had shattered her faith in the industry she'd grown up around. She'd withdrawn from her internship at a major studio, talking about switching her major from film to social work. "How is she?" "Angry, but also proud of what you did. She said watching you fight back taught her something about standing up to bullies, even when they have power over you." Stallone nodded, filing that away as something precious. If his daughter learned to recognize manipulation and resist it, perhaps some good could come from Byrne's cruelty. They drove in comfortable silence through the Hollywood hills, past mansions where other actors were probably struggling with their own version of industry pressure. How many others, Stallone wondered, were being manipulated by people who viewed human suffering as raw material for entertainment? At home, he found himself drawn to his office, where the walls displayed decades of movie posters and awards. The Rocky poster from 1976 hung in the place of honor, that iconic image of a small-time fighter getting his shot at greatness. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd built his career on stories about underdogs fighting corrupt systems, never imagining he'd become the victim of one. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps every story about standing up to bullies prepared you for the moment when you had to do it yourself. Jennifer appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, steam rising like incense in the afternoon light. She'd been seeing a therapist to process what she called vicarious trauma, the psychological damage that came from watching someone you love be systematically destroyed, even if the destruction was ultimately illusory. "Any regrets?" she asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. Stallone considered the question seriously. His comeback was permanently derailed now. No studio would touch him after the scandal. Byrne's footage would never see the light of day, which meant the transcendent performance would remain forever unseen. His career, which had been artificially destroyed for Byrne's experiment, would never be artificially resurrected. "No," he said, and meant it. Some things are more important than comebacks. Outside, Los Angeles continued its eternal hustle, the city of dreams grinding forward with mechanical persistence. But inside this house, in this moment, Sylvester Stallone had found something more valuable than any role: the quiet dignity of choosing truth over illusion, even when the illusion promised everything he'd lost. The sun set behind the Hollywood sign, painting the sky the color of old movie posters, and for the first time in months, Stallone's hands were perfectly still.